My name is Michelle. In case you don't know me, I'm a senior. I have been working with some other people to put together this series of lectures on women's empowerment. This is a topic that's really close to my heart. I sort of have two goals for this series. The first is to encourage all of you, regardless of your gender, to use your voice and your gifts and your passions to serve God and the rest of the world. My second goal is to highlight some female faculty that we have on campus who are really intelligent, passionate women who are here to be role models to us. And one of those women is Dr. Holly Beers. Holly grew up in a Christian family in central Minnesota, the land of 10,000 lakes and long snowy winters. Yes. She has always wanted to use her gifts to honor God, and during her senior year in college, she felt called to the world of biblical academia. Holly's passions include the New Testament and the people of God, and her deepest desire is to see the people of God understand the Bible and integrate it well in their own lives and communities. Holly married her best friend Max after seminary, and the last 8 years have been a flurry of PhD work, teaching college and seminary classes, and parenting two little boys, Noah and Moses. So with that, I will turn the evening over to Dr. Beers. I'm a walker, so do I have to stay right here with this microphone? Is that okay? All right. And because I need to be by my screen too, so I can do some talking and pointing. I'm a pointer. So thanks for coming. I'm happy to see your faces. It's exciting for me to be here. Before you just hear my kind of academic spiel, which is part of this, I need you to understand a few more things about me, my family. Oh, there he is. This is my husband, Max. And he is younger than me. And right now, in this picture, he has glasses and a beard, and his head hair is really short, but you just never know what you're going to get with Max. When our kids were born, he had long hair that he put in a ponytail. He was a high school teacher in Minnesota, and he gave up his tenured teaching job to come here with me so I could take this job, which is pretty amazing and makes him the best man that I know and that I've ever known. And he's a stay-at-home dad right now with our two little boys. He's always thought he would want to be a stay-at-home parent, and when we moved out here, he said, "Hey, this is my chance. I want to take this first year and be home with my boys." And I said, "Really?" And he said, "Honey, how many dads get to spend serious, committed time with their sons?" So he doesn't change diapers anymore. He probably trained our youngest at 21 months because he didn't like changing diapers. So he doesn't change diapers anymore, but he feeds them and takes them to the park and the zoo and puts them down for naps. And he's amazing, and he's been my biggest support in this whole academic life that I've been doing. And here, this is me and the boys. So we are from Minnesota, the land of long, snowy winters, and there's crazy snow in Minnesota right now, and we call our Minnesota friends and laugh, ha, ha, ha. But because we're transplants, we go to the beach every weekend. It doesn't matter if it's cold, according to California people. So we just get dressed up, and we walk down there, and we walk the beaches, and we pick up rocks, and we talk about the water, and they love it. So they're climbing here, and I climbed up in front. It was hard with my coffee in my hand, but I did it. So that's Noah on the far side. He'll be 4 in a couple of weeks. And he's asking really deep theological questions like, "Mom, where is Jesus?" That's a good one. And he asks a lot of questions, too, about who made what. "Mommy, who made the moon?" And I'll say, "Who do you think?" And I'm going to say, "Jesus." And I'll say, "Yes." And he'll say, "Thank you, Jesus." It's pretty sweet. Moses, he talks, but it's a little more subdued. He's 2. He turned 2 in January. So it is kind of funny that I have Old Testament names for my kids because I teach New Testament. But we love these strong names. And Moses, it took me a while to get on board with because it's a little different. I don't know very many Moseses, but Max said, my husband, he said, "Who cares if it's different or people?" Because I said, "What if people make fun of him or us?" And he said, "Who cares?" He said, they're probably just jealous because they don't have the guts to name their kid Moses. So those are my boys. And they're an important part of my story. I'm going to share a little bit about kind of how I came to care about this so much, this topic of gender and Bible and roles for people and authority and all of that.
Because when you see where it comes from for me, I think it'll help you understand why I'm so passionate about it tonight. I care about it more than probably most topics. This first point where I say family, church, Bible camp, college, an inconsistent message of gender relationships. This is what I mean. I grew up in a church that said, technically, women can do whatever they're called to do. Technically. And so I heard that message, but then I looked around and I didn't see any female leaders. They were all men. And even as a kid, I wondered about that. I also grew up in a church where I was told the man is the head, which means he's in charge, he makes the decisions, and the woman submits and follows. Then I looked at my own parents' marriage and I thought, that's not really, I don't really see that. It wasn't what I would call an unhealthy or angry, aggressive. It's not like my mom dominated my dad, pounced on him or anything. But it was much more of a partnership mentality, where my mom made certain kinds of decisions in her areas, I would say, and my dad made other ones. And so I thought, even as a kid, I thought, I'm not sure what to think about this or how to handle this. Bible camp. At camp, I went to these really amazing teen camps. I don't know how many of you did in the summers, but they were the highlight of my life. Really fun, long services. But you're there with your friends, and the music is really good, and lots of cute boys. That's always fun, too. And there, too, I heard this message of women, what is God calling you to do kind of language. But all the speakers were always male, and everyone who had any kind of authority was male. And I thought, so if I feel called to be a pastor, you'll pray for me, but you won't bring in a female pastor to talk to me. That's interesting. College. Technically, the college I went to, too, is kind of like Westmont, where there was some freedom on this issue. In other words, where women could be in leadership and they could say they felt called to something, and we were encouraged that way. But I was trying to think about this, and without pulling out my transcript, I can't quite remember, but I don't think I had a single female professor who taught Bible or theology my entire time at my Bible college. And I thought, this is interesting. I'm not sure. I wish someone would model this for me so I could see it and experience it instead of just hearing that it's okay. And then, of course, I had some friends at my college who said, as a woman, no, you can't do whatever you want. You can't be in leadership. You can't speak. You can't teach. The Bible says that somewhere. And sometimes people would say, I think Paul said that. It's in that one book. But bless my heart, I didn't actually look it up. I mean, I had read my Bible so many times, but I read it in this weird way. When I look back on how I used to read my Bible, I didn't pay very close attention, which is weird because normally I pay attention when I read and I remember things, but I didn't read my Bible that way. So I didn't know what was going on. I felt called to do something to honor God with my life when I was in college. And at first I thought maybe I was going to be a missionary because in my home context growing up, you're either a missionary or pastor if you want to serve God with your life. So at first I thought, missionary, and then I took some classes and I went on some trips and I thought, I don't know, maybe not. What's my other option? Pastor. So I actually have a youth ministries degree from my undergrad, and I did my internship, and I came home and I said to my Mom, I loved that, but I don't know. I don't know if that's what I'm supposed to do. And the way it's always worked with me and God is that I felt like God has led me places. And I've always felt like I could say no if I wanted to, but I usually said yes because it never worked out well for me if I said no. So I said to my mom, I feel like I'm supposed to do something. I'm supposed to honor God with my gifts, but I don't know what that is. My mom said, God will tell you. And I thought, no, I'm waiting. God, where is it? Then my senior year, spring semester, I had a theology class with this theologian named Amos Young, who's actually getting pretty famous these days. And he was the first person in my life who ever said to me, you could do this, the academic life. On a paper he gave back to me, he actually said something like, you should go to grad school. You have the capabilities to do this. Let's talk after class or on a break. So I went up to him on a break and I said, Dr. Young, please, can I do this? Do I have what it takes? And he said, this is a really long conversation. He gave me his card. And he said, call me sometime, maybe this weekend, and we'll talk. And on our phone conversation, he said the most amazing things to me, like, Holly, the academy is really dominated by men, and it is. And he said, women bring different things to the table of scholarship. Will you join us at the table? And I said, yes. I mean, what an invitation. And my life just clicked for me in that moment, because here's the thing. I've always been a school person. I've always loved to read and write and learn and study. And I felt so validated for the first time, where I felt like, wow, I can use my natural gifts and abilities, and maybe I can honor God with that somehow. And so he was the one who told me, he said, you need to go to grad school, go to seminary. So I did. I ended up in seminary. And another interesting part of my story is that up to this point, as you know, I've had some kind of inconsistent pieces here, but I hadn't ever worked that out. I had pretty much avoided it. I hadn't felt the need to really do that yet. And I was in my first semester of seminary in the fall, and there was a male student in one of my classes, and I can see the class in my head, the room. I can see where I was standing. You ever have moments like this where when you look back, you could say, oh, I was sitting right there, or I was touching that, or whatever. And I was standing there, and he said to me, his name was Jeremy, he said, Holly, to be honest, I don't know. We didn't know each other, by the way, so this is even more awkward. He said, Holly, I got to tell you, I don't know if I think you should be here. And I said, oh. And he said, well, the Bible says that women aren't allowed to teach or be in any kind of leadership in the church, so you really probably shouldn't be here. And in that classroom, I was, for one thing, so overwhelmed that I don't think I even responded to him. I was thinking about that today, and I thought, I don't think I said anything to him, because I didn't have anything to say. At first, I was just so overwhelmed, and then he moved past me, and I stood there. For how long, I don't know. I stood there, and then after a while, I got angry, but then he was gone. It was too late to be angry. And I thought, okay, this is it. It's time. It's time for me to think about this, to find the text that people talk about when they act like it's obvious that women shouldn't be allowed to do anything. I need to investigate. So that led me on this journey, and I've been doing this for years. I know these PowerPoints are a little lame for a fun Monday night thing, but it helps me keep on track, and then it helps you sense where I'm going too. So this is where it started for me. Well, actually, I started looking up the ministry texts for women in the church, and there are two main ones people use in the New Testament. But then I thought, for me, this issue really is part of the larger gender kind of issue, or sex, the relationship between the sexes issue. What is God's plan for that? Because for me, the marriage, the way we view marriage, and the man and wife, husband and wife responding to each other, has a lot in common with the church relationship. In other words, if we tell women in the church that they're empowered and they can be leaders, then we tell them in the home, you're not a leader, you're a follower. You're not even a peer, you're a follower. That's inconsistent. And I wondered about that as a kid. So for me, this discussion of gender grows out of the larger topic of what is God's plan? What does the Bible see as God's plan for the male-female relationship? So I'm going to talk about marriage first quickly, and then we're going to talk about the two main texts that people use, and I'll tell you how I work through them and think about them. I'm sorry if you can't see very well over there. I can always make this available later if anyone needs PowerPoints, extra PowerPoints in your life, you get extra time. So there is this passage in Genesis 1 that people often refer to. And 27. So God has created the creatures, done that whole thing, and then God says in verse 26, let us make, and my translation says human beings, in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created human beings in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. When I was researching this, I realized that some people, based on the translation they were using, they were saying things like, and God said, let us make man in our image. And people actually make the claim sometimes that because it says that in their Bible, that only men are created in God's image. Which, of course, if you start with that, the rest of it for women is all downhill. Women aren't even created in God's image. That's pretty bad news for us, as who are women in this room. So, the Hebrew word, Adam, which you can see where we get our name Adam from, that's kind of a cool name, right? Has the sense in this passage of humans, not man. And of course, man and woman are given the task of stewarding the earth together. These passages from Genesis become really important because in the New Testament in various places, Paul or others will refer to them as being God's creational ideal, as being God's plan. So I had to put my PowerPoint way down. I have way more things to say, but we don't have time tonight. Another passage that matters for this, Genesis 2:18. This is where it says, "The Lord God said, it is not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him." So Adam has been created, and now Adam's missing something. He needs a helper. My whole life, when people talked about marriage, they said things like, well, Eve is the helper, which means that she is the follower. She's the subordinate, and the man is in charge. The husband is in charge. And if you want to argue that, you have a few problems, because to assume that helper is a subordinate thing is an assumption, not an obvious kind of fact. In the Old Testament, this word for helper is used to describe God as the helper of Israel. I was talking about this with my husband over dinner tonight. He said, so, what are you going to say? And I said, well, I need to talk about a few words like helper. And he said, yeah, helper. We make gender jokes, but we can because we know how our marriage works. So he said, yeah, you're my helper. Get in the kitchen. And I said, ha, ha, ha. I said, you know what, honey, even if I am in the kitchen, helpers help from a position of strength. They provide something that's lacking or missing. And he said, ooh, good one. But think about that. Helpers do provide something from a position of strength. They provide something that's needed, that's missing. And no one would ever, of course, argue that God is subordinate to Israel, ever. But he helps from a position of strength. Genesis 3 in the fall. I've heard this used many times. Where it says in Genesis 3, your husband will rule over you. Your husband will rule over you. And people have said it's in the Bible. Must be true. I like the idea that if something's in the Bible, that means it's valuable to think about. But what I always say is, think about the narrative placement of this. In other words, at what point in the story does this happen? This happens after Adam and Eve have sinned. And this is partly her punishment, or some scholars would say her consequence, that her husband will rule over her. This means that this is not God's creational intent, God's creational ideal. And I was talking about this with my husband too, and he said, we've had this has been an ongoing discussion for us for years in our marriage, but he said, oh, right. He said, and if God is restoring creation, which I added that point after he said that, even though I was going to hopefully remember to talk about it, but he said, if God is restoring creation, then why are we holding on to the fall, the consequences of the fall, and saying, this is how it's supposed to be? And I said, exactly. We should rebel against the values of the fall, I would say. And if this is what Jesus comes to do, to fix what is broken in the world, and I say this to my New Testament students all the time, and some of you are here, so I'm sorry if this is redundant, but if salvation in the New Testament is about restoration and it's big, 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 then really we just take what happened at the fall and say, well, that's life, that's how it is? Or do we say, no, Jesus came to fix this, to restore what was lost by creation, and we rebel against it, and we say, this is not how God intended it to be. Couple comments on Ephesians 5. I've been to so many weddings where this passage gets used, and never once, except in my own wedding ceremony, where I had my PhD advisor do this passage and see what's really going on. And I looked out at the faces, and people looked scared, and I thought, this might not have been the best venue. But I did have a captive audience. If no one could leave, here's my wedding. Strategic. Never once have I heard anyone preach this at a wedding and say anything about what the husband is supposed to do in this passage. And maybe you have, and if you have, I say, yay for you. Lucky you. I had never heard it. I had never heard it stressed in any kind of context at all. So this is the passage where Paul says things like, let's see, wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands, as you do to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Every discussion I'd ever heard of it ended there. And the few things that many things we need to notice about this is that the whole section begins with submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. It does not begin with wives, submit to your own husbands. Submit to one another is how it starts. Which, in other words, frames the whole section then. It says this section, it announces itself to us. This section is about mutual submission, submitting to each other. Why? out of reverence for Christ. In other words, this is getting at something that's at the heart of the gospel. Mutual submission, mutual sacrifice, you could say. Mutual self-sacrifice, because it's a sacrifice to submit. It hurts sometimes. But the mutuality of that is at the heart of the gospel. Who's the ultimate sacrificer? Jesus. The ultimate sacrificer. Models this and embodies this. In some Bible translations, it does not begin the paragraph with verse 21. It begins it with verse 22. Wives, submit to your own husbands. That is very frustrating for someone who teaches Greek. And it should be frustrating for all the Greek students, I mean, because there is no verb in verse 22. Verse 22 in the Greek doesn't say, wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands. It says, wives, to your husbands, as to the Lord. Well, what to your husbands? You don't even know what you're doing unless you look at the verse in front of it, which says, submit. You need that verb. In other words, it shows these verses are so connected. It's one of the amazing things. I'll walk great. Everyone should take great. It's really fun. Isn't it, Katie?
Yes. So
Grace. It's so fun. So one of the other things that matters for this passage is that Paul says, wives, submit yourselves, for the husband is the head of the wife. In my whole life, the only option I had ever heard for this word, the word in Greek is kephale, is this idea of headship. Often people talked about it in kind of head of a department term. Well, clearly, it's like being the head of the department, which means you're in charge and you make all the decisions and everyone else falls in line. People would make comments like, well, a good boss, though, doesn't just order people around, talks to people, treats them well, and so that's what the husband should do for the wife. And I always thought, something about that makes me kind of inherently uncomfortable, and a big part of it was that I didn't see my parents interacting that way at all. My dad did not order my mom around. She also did not order him around. So they talked about everything. And this word can be translated in a couple different ways, head or source. The idea of source might seem kind of unusual at first, and you think, I don't know if I buy that, Holly. But if source is pointing to the creation story, it's possible. In the creation story, who is the source of whom? In Genesis 2. Who is the source of whom? Who's created first? Adam. He's the source of Eve through his rib. And people have said, a stretch. A stretch maybe until Paul quotes from Genesis 2. Later on in the passage. Where, I'm sorry, did I say that in a mean way? I didn't mean it in a mean way. He says, he quotes from Genesis 2, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. If Paul uses the creation story here, I think this makes this translation much more likely. However, I would say I'm also okay with using headship language as long as we clarify and remind ourselves what the headship of a crucified Lord looks like. Who is the ultimate sacrificer? Who embodies the heart of the gospel, and what does that look like? Does Christ come and dominate everybody and order everyone around? He has some harsh critiques for insiders, people who think that they've got it all figured out and made. But what does he think about dominance? Should they lord it over each other, or is that what the Gentiles do? So honestly, I'm okay with either one of these options as long as we talk about what they mean and as long as we read the rest of the passage. Verse 25, husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. And then he keeps going on about it. He's excited about this idea. What does mutual submission look like? The wife submits. Wives, submit to your husbands. How radical is that in a first century world? For anyone who knows anything about the first century world. Snooze. We've heard that. And they did. That was a traditional thing to say to women. Submit to your husbands. What does mutual submission look like? Remember, that's the header for this whole section. What does it look like for the man, the husband? He loves his wife. He gives up his life for his wife. That's what Jesus did. And that's the parallel that Paul draws. He gives up his life for his wife. How radical is that in a first century context? That would have really caused their antennae to go up. Whoa, what is this? Nothing was ever required for husbands. And Paul requires something here, and a radical something. My husband and I joke about this too, when he says things like, wife, submit. And I say, when was the last time you gave up your life for me? No. But then you know what I've been thinking lately? I've been thinking that someone who gave up their tenured teaching job to move across the country and be a stay-at-home dad gave up his life for his wife. And it's been pretty amazing and powerful for our marriage. So, a little submission doesn't hurt. Mutual submission. All right. There are a few passages, two passages that we're going to talk about that are the text where Paul, assuming Paul's the author of the Timothy one, we're not going to talk about that in detail, but where Paul seems to limit women in the church. But before we get to that, I would like to briefly, in a few minutes, mention these, because we have two where Paul says things like women should be silent, women are not allowed to teach. But we have way more than that that point toward equality, that point toward women participating in leadership kinds of positions, and speaking and teaching. And they don't get mentioned very often, so I like to highlight them because that's fun. And it helps round out the discussion by bringing in all or at least more of the relevant texts. I am tired of people pointing to the passage in 1 Corinthians 14 and saying things like, well, see, Paul says here, women must be silent. And I think, well, that's dissatisfying to me on a lot of levels, but especially to act like that's the only text that matters. And not even the rest of 1 Corinthians 14. It comes from 1 Corinthians 14. What else is going on there? That might matter. So this is my attempt to say, hey, let's broaden it a little bit and talk about all the texts that might matter for this issue, so we can think about them well. Women as the first witnesses to Jesus' resurrection in the Gospels. The women are called by New Testament scholars the apostles to the apostles, because they were there and they witnessed Jesus before Peter and the others did. And the Gospels highlight that. They could have omitted that, by the way, if they wanted to, because in a first century world, you might not want to advertise that the women were the first ones there, but the Gospel writers include that. That is very powerful to me. They're targeted as leaders in books like Acts, too. Acts is the best book in the New Testament, the best one. Priscilla, as a co-worker and teacher of men like Apollos. When their teaching is mentioned, her name is listed first, which is an ancient way, a Greek language way of prioritizing her or highlighting her contribution. So she shows up in Romans and Acts. Apostles like Junia. Here's my favorite one. Some translations will say the name Junius, which is a man's name. There was no such thing as the male name Junius in the ancient world. But some translators who had decided that there's no way this could be a woman, the name Junia was a very common female name, and translators who had decided there was no way a woman could be an apostle changed the name to Junius, which has many issues involved in that. Deacons and benefactors or leaders like Phoebe. In Romans 16, Paul calls her a deacon. Many translations will translate that as helper or servant, which though you can translate that word that way, in those ways. But what's interesting to me about that is that when Paul talks about men using that word, the New Testament translators like to use the word deacon for the men. And I think this is an interesting translational move here. It tells us a lot about where the people are coming from who translate. And if you know anything about translation, I mean, you have to make calls all over the place. Right, Katie? Everyone makes calls. So it's not fair for me to say, they're making calls and I don't make calls. I would make a call too, but I would say, hey, if we're going to translate this word as deacon when it's used to discuss the men, then maybe we should translate it as deacon when it's used to discuss the women too. She's described as a benefactor. In other words, someone who has the ability to benefact people. I made that word up. To benefit people. She has the power and the resources to do that. And also the way this language gets used in Romans 16 probably means that she brought the letter. And she was the letter carrier, deliver, in other words, which also means that if people would have had questions about it, if she brought it from Paul, who's the first person they would ask to explain it? Phoebe, our good friend Phoebe the deacon. Go Phoebe. Many people use this passage in Galatians 3:28, very famous. No male or female, slave nor free, Jew nor Gentile, Jew nor Greek. They are all one in Christ Jesus. I would say this matters for this issue too. In that passage, Paul isn't talking about leadership. He's not saying, well, I'm talking about apostles here. Or I'm talking about deacons. He's just talking about the social leveling that the gospel brings. In a stratified, structured world where everyone ranks in different places and everyone knows it, the gospel is the great levelizer, the great equalizer. And that happens for theological reasons like, hey, if everyone has God's Spirit, Pentecost, Acts 2, if everyone has the Spirit of God, that levels out the access issue because everyone has access now instead of just a few people who had the Spirit before. So because of realities like that and the gospel leveling all that out, it's easy for Paul to say, all one in Christ Jesus. So, a couple thoughts on that. Now, I have just a couple slides on the two difficult passages, and then we're going to do questions, if anyone has any for me. Sorry if this is really small for people who are far away. 1 Corinthians 14, let me just read it for you and let it sink in for a second. Women should remain silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission, as the law says. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands at home, for it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in the church. So, this is one of the passages that people use to say, obviously, clearly. I mean, could Paul be any clearer here? So obvious that women aren't allowed to say anything. Let's think about that for a minute. So I subtitled this Timeless Principle or Contextually Specific Issue. And these are the two directions people go. The people who argue that this is a timeless principle would say, Paul said women should be silent, which means that in all places, at all times, everywhere, women are not allowed to speak in church settings. The contextually specific issue view says, yeah, Paul seems to be limiting some women here. But we don't think he's limiting all women for all time. And that's more the direction I go, in case you were wondering. It was a big mystery. So a couple things, I had such a hard time deciding what to include on here. A couple things that you should know. Some scholars, like Fee, and I know I keep calling Katie out on this, we had such a good discussion on this, didn't we? In our Greek class. Gordon Fee is a world-famous text critic. That's his specialty area, which means that he compares the Greek manuscripts for the New Testament. We have all these copies, for example, of 1 Corinthians in Greek that were handwritten, copied by scribes. And he compares those and checks to see if all of the versions that we have of 1 Corinthians are the same. Or if there are differences, why might we have differences? Which one of these is wrong? Which one of these is right? That kind of thing. That's what he does, and he's argued that these verses are a later addition. In other words, Paul didn't write them. Someone else added them later. He argues that on text-critical grounds. These verses move around in 1 Corinthians, and part of the argument goes like this. If Paul really wrote them, why couldn't the ancient people decide where to put them? It would be obvious where they belong. Paul wrote these verses. Some people have not found that to be convincing. Fee also he's Pentecostal, so he comes from a tradition that encourages women to use their gifts, and they ordain and license women as pastors. So people have said, foul, Fee, foul, you just want to be able to say in your own context so we can do whatever they want. And he would say back, everyone speaks from their own context. That is not a fair critique of me. You're speaking from your own context too, and you tell me that when you can't. Even if they are original, they need to be read in their context. In other words, in chapter 14. What's going on in chapter 14? Paul's big concern is that the church gets built up. Paul talks about two main gifts in 1 Corinthians 14. Does anyone know what they are? What? Good job. Speaking in tongues and prophecy. And he prefers prophecy. He highlights it more in chapter 14 because it's edifying for the community. Where people who speak in tongues, Paul would say, if they're unintelligible, no one can understand what you're saying, all you're doing is edifying yourself. And And Paul says, my paraphrase, get over yourselves. It's not all about you. It's about your community. So start prioritizing gifts that are good for the group. And at the end of the chapter, he limits some people who aren't doing a good job. And this limiting of women is included in the end section, where other people have been limited also. So let's see. It seems that some women were interrupting and disrupting the time of prophecies or weighing of prophecies. That seems like it could be what's going on here, because right before it, he's talking about how, let's see, verse 29, 2 or 3 prophets should speak, and the others should weigh carefully what is said. Is that from God or not? And if a revelation comes to someone who is sitting down, the first speaker should stop. Take your turn and then be done. That's my paraphrasing. We talk a lot about turns in my house. I have a 2-year-old and a 3-year-old, so whose turn is it? And don't hog someone else's turn. For you can all prophesy in turn so that everyone may be instructed and encouraged. Spirits of prophets are subject to the control of prophets, for God is not a God of disorder, but of peace, as in all the congregations of the Lord's people. And then he says, women should be silent. So it seems likely, or at least possible, that Paul's saying, in reference to what I just said, women can't participate in that. They're not doing a good job with it. They're interrupting maybe and disrupting. The key point here is that this is limited, not absolute silencing. In chapter 11, Paul makes clear that women are praying and prophesying during the public church gatherings. Another good reason why we need to read the whole book altogether, because in 1 Corinthians 11, Paul says things like this. Oh, let's see. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head, but every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. He's talking about women wearing head coverings, which that's another issue we could talk about if we had time. But he assumes there that women are praying and prophesying, which would be in the kind of public, gathered church setting. So women are speaking, in other words, in the Corinthian church. They are speaking using their voice in the gathering time. So because of that, when we get to 1 Corinthians 14, 3 chapters later, and Paul says women should remain silent, what do? Some scholars have said, well, Paul changed his mind in 3 chapters. Most people don't like that, though. That doesn't sound very good for Paul. And Paul seems smarter than that, to be honest. So if Paul's aware that women are speaking, if he's assuming it, that they're speaking, why would he limit some women here? I got to share something with you, which a few of you have heard before. If you've been in a class of mine, I'm sorry, but who's heard of Ken Bailey? My favorite guy. My buddy Ken Bailey here. This book is called Paul Through Mediterranean Eyes. This guy is an academic scholar who's lived in Mediterranean contexts for almost 50 years. And he's written commentaries on Jesus, stuff in the Gospels, and then this one's on 1 Corinthians. And he suggests something that is revolutionizing this discussion in New Testament studies, and people are talking about it. It's a hot topic thing right now. Where he says, what's going on in this passage is that women are chatting during the church gathering, chatting with their friends. And that's why Paul tells them to be quiet. And now, from a modern 21st century kind of perspective, North America, people have said, why would they chat? It's ridiculous. And he says, let's see, I've lived in this part of the world for a long time, and most scholars would agree that culturally there's still a lot in common with this part of the world now in terms of how it relates to 2,000 years ago. In other words, in 2,000 years, a lot of things have been in continuity, have remained the same. So he talks about this. He says Greek was the common language in the first century world, at least in terms of what I would call a trade language. People in their local areas spoke dialects. But if you wanted to communicate outside of your subgroup, your subculture, you had to speak Greek. It was like the English of the ancient world. Corinth is known in the ancient world for its diversity. People from all over the Roman Empire ended up there. It was a melting pot city. In other words, you would have people there who spoke any language imaginable. How do all of them communicate? If they need to get together and talk, they use Greek. That's how Greek functioned for them in the ancient world. But Bailey makes the point that many women would not have had much access to it. Because of the assumed social roles of many women in the ancient world, they would have been probably in the home doing that kind of work, and their husbands, their men, would have been out and had more access to learning Greek. So he says that maybe the women would have started chatting as they asked each other questions. If they were in a church gathering where the language of the gathering was Greek, because that's how people could communicate from mixed backgrounds, And if the women's Greek wasn't very good, can you imagine being them and listening to that? What would you do? What was that word? What did he say? What did she say? I didn't pick it up. I've been in places where I took Spanish in college, bless my heart, and when you're in situations where your Spanish isn't very good and everyone else is really good, you feel lost and stupid, which feels good too, right? So I'm going to just read you a few lines from this. 4:12. When a speaker's words, he says he's been in situations like this. The problem of accent is part of it. Often when a speaker is functioning in a second language, even when the speaker is fluent, there can be great difficulty in communication due to accent. When a speaker's words and phrases are not understood, a low buzz can break out as listeners ask each other, "What did she say? What was that word?" And he says, take this seriously. If this is what's going on, what would this mean for what Paul is saying here? He also makes the point that those with limited access to educational systems often have short attention spans. In other words, for these women, most of whom would have never been in any kind of structured academic setting, how long is your attention span if there's teaching going on? Or if there's a lot of speaking going on, even if it's prophecies or other words where you can't understand it. And again, some people would say, I don't know, I mean, are these women, we don't want to say they're stupid. You would say they're not stupid. But think about it, you've never been in a structured setting. I was telling my husband about this before I came, and I said, I kind of want to use the example of Noah, our almost 4-year-old, even though it's not a perfect parallel, clearly. But think about my almost 4-year-old who hasn't been in preschool yet and is the most active, busy child that I can imagine. There might be another busier, more active one out there, but he is so all the time, and I keep saying to Max, he needs to be in preschool. He needs to be in preschool so he can start learning the structure piece because he's all over the board. He's crazy. I mean, he won't sit still, and he jumps and he runs, and when we drop him off in our church at the kids thing, sometimes we come back to get him, and they say he had to have a timeout because he wouldn't sit on the carpet during the story. And I'm, yep, that sounds about right for him. Why should he sit on the carpet during the story? So it's not a great parallel, but that's the kind of thing that Bailey's drawing attention to. He says, take this seriously. And finally, ancient cultures were oral cultures, and some cultures today are still predominantly oral cultures. Maybe not in our part of the world, but in other parts of the world. Which means that external processing is typical. If you hear something, you have to process externally because you can't write it down and take a note. You can't type it out on your computer. The way to help yourself remember it is to speak it. Let's see. What pages numbers do I have for that? 415 to 416. Middle Eastern society is predominantly an oral culture. People process information by talking more than by sitting quietly and reflecting. This can be observed at many levels of society. A university professor will have the attention of the class and turn to write something on the whiteboard, maybe we should say. The moment he or she pauses to write, the entire class breaks out talking. They are not inattentive or rude, they are simply turning to a fellow student and chatting about the subject. My husband was a high school teacher in a very diverse inner city school, and I ran this idea by him, and he said, yes, he said, I think that is true of my students who come from all over the world. He said, I had to learn as a teacher that they weren't being rude when they were processing with their friends. And I thought, So, to give you a sense of what Bailey would do with this passage, this is his sum of the passage where Paul says women must be silent. To the women, I know your Greek is limited, but your husbands have learned a bit more Greek than you have, than you have managed to absorb. They have to in order to function on the job. You have not had this chance, and it is not your fault. But things have gotten out of hand on a number of levels. Please be helpful and put your questions to your husbands after you return home. I have just told the speakers when to be quiet. This is a situation in which you also need to listen quietly, even if you can't follow what is said. In other words, Bailey would say this is not an eternal limiting of all women in all times and places. Paul is saying to some women here, in the same way that he said to other speakers, the tongue speakers and the prophets, that you can't just speak out whenever you want and say whatever you want in a public gathering. Disruptive. Some scholars have said, well, I don't know if I like this because it seems to be belittling the women. They They already don't know their Greek very well, and then Paul says, ask at home. And I can see that critique, I can hear that. I would also say, though, that in this whole section of 1 Corinthians, Paul is prioritizing the whole community. Again and again, he says to smaller groups and individuals within the community, it's not about you, it's about the whole community, what's best for everyone. And that's pretty powerful and scary if you think about that. If it is about what's best for the church, what does that mean for your personal desires and wants? So this means where women have educational and linguistic access, which in places like our world, places like our context here, and are not being disrupted in the church, presumably too, they are not being limited. This passage is not inherently about limiting one's sex. I need to hurry, 7:50. This is my last one. It's really small. I didn't realize it was going to be so far away from some of you. I'm sorry. You're welcome to come over here and stand, but I'll read you parts of it. This is the big one. Oh, this is not my Bible. 1 Timothy. 1 Timothy 2. A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not the one deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. But women will be saved through childbearing. That's so clear and helpful. Thank you, Paul. We'll talk about that. Women will be saved through childbearing. If they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety. Most people, to be honest, kind of ignore that last verse. Because what does it mean to be saved through childbearing? We are going to talk about it briefly, but we'll say, I don't know. And if you've had a child, you don't really feel like you're being saved. You feel like you're dying through childbearing. So it's not very relevant. Okay, so Paul, what I would like to point out is that Paul's first or main point is that women should learn. A woman should learn, and then he says, in quietness and full submission. But the very fact that he says that they should learn, which was not the norm in their world and context, is interesting. He's not saying, don't teach those women. They're too stupid to learn anyways. He says, a woman should learn. He says, in quietness and full submission, or with full submission here. Many people have assumed that that's full submission to men. You should learn in quietness and full submission to men. Paul does not say that. He leaves it there with full submission. So other people have said, who says this is about submission to men? It could be submission to God or the gospel. Don't we want men to be in submission to God or the gospel when they learn too? To put themselves under the authority of the gospel and learn well and take it in well? Let's see. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. This is verse 12. This teaching thing, this is where I would say, because we clearly see other New Testament women teaching, this is one of the main reasons why I don't think that this passage is a timeless principle. I think it's addressing a contextually specific issue. Otherwise, we run into the problem of what about the other women who teach? What do we do with them? Like Priscilla. Junia is an apostle. I'm presuming she's teaching. That's what apostles did. It was a major part of their task. But Paul says women can't teach here. This seems to point to the limiting being in this church community. He says he does not permit a woman next to assume authority over. That's what my translation says. Some translations use words like dominate or domineer. This is one of those great translational issues where people say, oh, what do we do with this word? This word only occurs in one place in the New Testament, which means we don't have the best idea of how to translate it. So this is a bless our hearts moment. The translators say, oh, shoot. What do we do with this dirty, stupid word here? It's helpful if Paul uses the same words over and over again, because then we can look to other places in Paul and say, oh, see how he uses it here? Helpful. But here, this is a one-timer word. So we have to look to other places outside of the New Testament, outside of the Bible. And we see related forms of this in the Greco-Roman world, in the Roman Empire world, where the connotations are not positive. Actually, some of them are very negative. I went to a session on this at a conference recently, and they were talking about how forms of this word get used to describe murderers. And I thought, that's a negative connotation. Or people who dominate aggressively and ruthlessly. this word shows up in contexts like that. So is Paul saying he doesn't permit a woman to assume authority, have any kind of authority over a man ever? Or is he saying, hey, no woman should ever murderously dominate a man? Does Paul ever want anyone to murderously dominate anyone? You could ask that question. Many scholars think that 1 Timothy was written to the church in Ephesus. Now, we don't know this for sure. So some scholars would say, well, if we can't know for sure, then I guess we better not even talk about it. It's not helpful. A lot of the good evidence that we have points toward Ephesus, though. So I wanted to give you this part of the story as an option. In Ephesus, we have something called the Artemis cult. Artemis was a female goddess, and if you see statues of her, she's covered in what look like breasts, maybe, all the way down her body. Some people have said, no, not breasts, they're testicles. Well, that's still, you can get her, she's the goddess of fertility, so you can still get that idea from testicles or breasts. All the people who were priests in her cult were women. Women-only cult, women-led cult. They ran the show. They called the shots, which was pretty unique in the ancient world to have a female-only cult like that, where there was so much power given to women. And this was a major cult. People came from all over the world to visit the temple of Artemis, to worship there. So many scholars have said, if this is the context, and some women from the Artemis cult have become Christians now, but this was their context. This is where they come from, in a place where, surprisingly, in the ancient world, women dominate, actually. Women run the show. Women call the shots. Can we see why Paul might have had to say to some of them, guys, tone it down. You need to be quiet. Shh. You're damaging here. I think that that's historically very likely. Finally, we see in these other passages, which I won't read because of time, but you're welcome to read them, 1 Timothy 2, 9, 5, 13, 2 Timothy 3, 6. This church community had some issues with their women. These are other verses where Paul addresses issues that some of the women are dealing with. Problems, they're creating gossiping, maybe being led astray by false teachers, that kind of idea. So it would make sense that some women might need to be limited in this context if this is what's going on. All right. The next verse that matters here, he says, verse 13, Adam was formed first, then Eve. Many scholars have said, well, Adam was formed first, which means he's the best one. Not really. They don't want to say the best, they say prominent. He has priority. He's first, and we know first is best. I was sharing this with my husband, and he said something so interesting over dinner. This is what it's like to be married to me, by the way. You have these discussions at dinner, and he does very well with it. But I brought this up, and he said, first is best. He said, yeah, except in the Old Testament, God doesn't ever use those firstborn sons. He uses the second or later-born sons. And I said, oh, you're so right. And he said, yeah, so that argument doesn't really work for me. And I thought, interesting. Good point, honey. Oh, you're so smart, honey. Good job. He's my best sounding board. So that's something I don't have on here, but that's a good point. Thank you, Max, for that. Order of creation. Paul seems to link being second here not with being inferior or lesser, but with deception. He talks about Eve's deception in the next verse. Adam was not the one deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. So her secondness is linked with her deception, and there's been a lot of talk about this. Why does being second equal being deceived? Some people have suggested that because she was second, she didn't know everything that Adam and God had talked about beforehand, so maybe she came in and she was missing some stuff. Other people have said, I don't know if I like that, I don't buy that. And Paul doesn't make the link clear. But what is interesting, though, and I say it somewhere here, is that in the other place in the New Testament, the only other place in the New Testament where Eve is discussed, there's deception in the passage again. And this is Paul, 2 Corinthians 11. Paul compares the Corinthian church, men and women, to Eve and warns them against being deceived. So he can use Eve to talk about men and women, not just to talk about women, and he likes to talk about Eve when he's talking about deception issues. Which is very interesting to me. So it seems to be the reason why women should learn is so that they don't do what Eve did. She was deceived. Women should learn so they're not deceived. Remember, he wants them to learn. Paul wants women to learn. Because Eve apparently didn't learn and was deceived. Adam was not deceived. Some people have said, oh, it's because Adam is awesome, the best one. Well, if you read other places in Paul calls Adam, everyone sins in Adam because of Adam's sin. Sin came into the world. So Paul does not let Adam off easily. But other people have said, well, maybe it doesn't mean he's the best one. Maybe it means he sinned deliberately. Eve was deceived. She didn't know what she was doing. Adam knew exactly what he was doing. Which, from an Old Testament perspective, is actually worse. To sin knowingly, you're held to a higher standard of judgment. You sin and you know what you're doing. So that's an interesting part of this. I lean that way. I buy that argument. Finally, last verse, the clearest one. Women will be saved through childbearing. They continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety. What does that mean, Paul? Thank you. Thank you so much. I just read a new article on this. I care so much about this topic that when new things come out, I read them because I like to see if there's anything new to say or if someone makes an argument that might matter for it. And it has been suggested that women are only saved theologically. They only get to be saved and go to heaven, wherever that is, if they bear children. But you can see the problems with this argument. View one, because what about all the women who don't bear children? They don't get to be saved? So hardly anyone goes that direction. It's hard to argue for. Two, they are only saved because of the childbirth, which is Jesus, in other words. But hey, women, even the ones who've been deceived in this passage in this church, they can be saved because of the childbirth, because of the ultimate one, the Jesus one. That's another option we can go, another direction we can go in. I like view three. Or these specific women in Ephesus will be kept safe in childbearing. The article I just read really detailed what I'd already been thinking, and people have kind of briefly mentioned where they've said. For all women in the ancient world, and for many women in different contexts in our world today, having a baby will be the most dangerous thing they ever do. The mortality rates are so high for women without access to the kind of medical care that we take for granted. In the ancient world, it was everyone would have known someone who had died in childbirth. Everyone. Rich, poor, you can't prevent it from happening. It happens. And it would be scary. And this is powerful for me because I probably would have died in childbirth with my first without medical intervention because he would not come out. And I pushed and pushed for hours and hours. And I could see where you get to the point where you just stop pushing and you would just be done because the 10-pound baby is stuck and does not come out. So this view would say, hey, this is the promise. This is the encouragement that Paul gives to these women who are being limited here. He says, okay, shh, no teaching. You guys have been deceived. No teaching. But your life isn't going to be a terrible, horrible mess. God will take care of you. God will take care of you in childbearing. This would be a very powerful promise for them. And if this passage is a contextually specific issue, and we're only talking about a few women in a church, then this would work. If we try to make this be about women at all times and all places, it doesn't work. Then you would have to say, well, not all women have been kept safe in childbearing. So personally, I like that one. I think it makes sense historically and contextually. So all of this means, in a context where women or people can learn so they are not deceived, if that's our reality, people can learn so they're not deceived, then people are not limited in terms of their teaching and authority and leadership. And that is all I have.